Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're setting the stage for a truly epic historical deep dive. We're going to trace the absolutely breathtaking trajectory of a small nomadic tribe. Imagine this, they're fleeing the Mongol invasions and somehow they managed to forge one of the most formidable, long-lasting empires in human history. We are unpacking the whole shebang, the rapid rise, that golden zenith, and then the spectacular, tragic collapse of the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, let's dive into this, because there's a massive paradox at the center of our story today. How does a global superpower, an empire that literally terrorized the greatest armies of Europe and controlled the absolute center of the world, ultimately decay into a geopolitical joke? How did they get branded by the Tsar of Russia as the sick man of Europe? Well, to understand that fall, we've got to first wrap our heads around the staggering scale of their success.
600 years. Just think about that for a second. In our world, modern nations seem to rise and fall in the blink of an eye, right? But the Ottoman dynasty maintained its iron grip for over 6 centuries, from 1299 all the way to the aftermath of World War I. This single family successfully navigated crusades, massive global discoveries, and world wars.
And they didn't just survive. They did it across 3 massive continents. At their absolute peak, the Ottomans controlled vast territories stretching across Asia, Europe, and Africa. We're talking from the snowy mountains of the Balkans straight down to the scorching deserts of Arabia, from the gates of Vienna to the bustling streets of Baghdad. They were, without a doubt, the undisputed bridge between East and West. Section 1. The Era of Expansion. From a nomad's tent to world power. Let's get right into it.
Now, this kind of growth, it wasn't an accident. It was a period of relentless, highly strategic expansion driven by fiercely ambitious warrior sultans. Just look at this timeline. It's astonishing. It all kicks off in 1299 with Osman. He's a Turkish chieftain who literally had a dream, like an actual dream, of a tree growing right out of his chest to cover the entire world. By 1326, they conquer Bursa, setting up their first real capital. But the real earth-shattering moment? That hit in 1453 when they pulled off the impossible and took Constantinople. Fast forward to 1517 and Sultan Selim I sweeps into Egypt. He's not just grabbing land here. He claims the title of the Caliphate. Boom. Just like that, the Ottoman Sultan is now the spiritual leader of the entire Muslim world.
So, what was the secret weapon behind all these astonishing conquests? Well, it was a totally unique military innovation, the Janissaries. See, in an era where Europe was still relying on, scattered knights and peasant levies, the Ottomans went ahead and created the world's first modern standing army. They took Christian boys from the Balkans, converted them, and then trained them rigorously from a very young age. These soldiers had no family, no outside loyalties, only to the Sultan himself. They were the ultimate, highly disciplined war machine.
And that machine was put to the ultimate test by a fiercely determined 19-year-old sultan named Mehmet II. Picture this. He's staring down the 1,000-year-old, totally impenetrable Roman walls of Constantinople, and he just declares, either I will conquer Istanbul or Istanbul will conquer me. Talk about confidence, right? But he backed it up with sheer tactical genius. When his ships were blocked by this massive chain strung across the harbor, he literally had 70 warships hauled over land on greased wooden planks in the dead of night. No joke. He even hired a Hungarian engineer named Orban to cast these massive bronze supercannons that finally shattered those legendary walls.
Section 2. The Golden Peak. The Zenith under Suleiman the Magnificent. Let's look at the height of their power.
During this era, we're talking the 16th century, the empire reached its absolute apex. Power, wealth, spiritual authority, they had it all. And the metrics here are just breathtaking. The Ottomans were now the sole custodians of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Their armies pushed so deep into Europe they were literally knocking on the gates of Vienna. Out on the water, their admiral, Haydarden Barbarossa, secured complete naval dominance across the entire Mediterranean. And culturally, it was a renaissance. Their chief architect, Mimar Sinan, was busy designing these magnificent, sweeping domed mosques that literally still define the skyline of modern Turkey today. They were the benchmark. The entire world envied them.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really dramatic pivot, which is kind of the central theme of our explainer today. When we put the empire's peak right up against its eventual decline, this really stark comparative timeline emerges. During their era of expansion, what do? We see meritocracy. We see rapid tech adoption, like those massive bronze cannons I mentioned. And we see warrior sultans out there fighting on the actual battlefield. But As internal stagnation sets in, we see the exact opposite. We get government by palace intrigue, the active banning of new technology like the printing press, and sultans who are literally locked away in cages. The rot, it started from the inside out.
Which brings us to Section 3, the cage of stagnation, palace intrigue, and the law of fratricide. So early on, Sultan Mehmed II instituted this incredibly brutal law of fratricide. Basically, it stated that a new sultan had to execute all of his brothers to prevent civil war. I know, it's ruthless, but it actually kept the state stable. However, eventually they tried to fix this brutal law, and in doing so, they created something arguably much worse, the kafes, or the cage. Instead of killing royal princes, they just started locking them up in secluded, windowless quarters of the palace for their entire lives. Imagine that. No education in statecraft, absolutely no experience leading armies, zero contact with the outside world. This suffocating isolation led to deeply mentally paralyzed rulers eventually taking the throne. Guys like Ibrahim the Mad, who famously spent his days just tossing gold coins into the palace pond to feed the fish.
Well, nature abhors a vacuum, right? With weak, mentally unstable sultans sitting on the throne, the Janissaries decided to step in and fill that power void. They completely devolved from being this highly disciplined military elite into a corrupt, king-making mafia. It was bad. When they were unhappy, they had this absolutely terrifying tradition where they would overturn their massive food cauldrons in the barracks to signal a rebellion. And in a really tragic twist of irony, these elite guards ended up brutally murdering their own master, the young Sultan Osman II. They literally dragged him from his bed. The ultimate protectors had become the executioners.
Moving on to Section 4, Rejecting the New World, the cost of intellectual stagnation.
So while the Ottomans were totally consumed by all these internal palace conspiracies and military mafia politics, they made a fatal mistake. They completely ignored the rapidly modernizing world just outside their borders. Europe was waking up. They were going through the Renaissance, discovering wildly lucrative trade routes to the Americas, and fully embracing the scientific revolution. Meanwhile, the Ottoman religious authorities issued a fatwa, a strict binding religious ruling, banning the printing press. They essentially locked their own citizens out of the future of knowledge. And even when they finally realized they were falling behind during their so-called tulip era, how did they try to fix it? By mimicking superficial European luxury. They built extravagant palaces and obsessed over tulips instead of adopting European science and heavy industry.
Finally, Section 5, the final collapse. The end of a 600-year dynasty.
Centuries of this internal rot, combined with explosive external pressures like the rise of nationalism, finally began to break this 600-year-old dynasty apart. That stinging moniker I mentioned earlier, the sick man of Europe, which was coined by the Tsar of Russia, it perfectly captured their 19th century reality. This once feared global superpower had become a complete geopolitical joke. By this point, Britain, France, and Russia were practically just standing around the empire's deathbed, tapping their watches, waiting for it to die so they could carve up its massive territories across the Middle East and the Balkans.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the road to the end was paved with a lot of desperate, but ultimately doomed, attempts to save the empire. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II finally crushes those corrupt Janissaries in what's known as the Auspicious Incident. Later on, Sultan Abdul Hamid II tries to hold the empire together using pan-Islamism, but he gets deposed by a young generation of military officers in 1909. And then, those new leaders made the absolute fatal gamble of entering World War I on the side of Germany. The resulting defeats completely shattered the empire, leading straight to the Sykes-Picot Agreement that arbitrarily carved up the modern Middle East we know today.
From the ashes of that immense defeat, a man named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk rose up to fight a fierce war of independence, ultimately saving the modern Turkish nation. But to pull that off, he realized something crucial. The heavy, suffocating burden of the past had to be buried for good. So on March 3, 1924, the 1,300-year-old system of the Caliphate was officially abolished. The very last Ottoman caliph was placed on a train in the dark of night, exiled with just a few spare coins in his pocket. And with that train ride, the sun had finally, permanently set on the Ottomans.
And that leaves us with a really powerful, lingering thought. You see, the Ottoman Empire didn't fall just because of outside swords. It fell because it stopped looking in the mirror. It suffocated on the intoxication of its own past greatness, and it completely refused to adapt to a changing world. It's a universal danger, really, for any nation, any business, and honestly, any individual. So ask yourself, do we have the courage to honestly look at our mistakes, or are we destined to be blinded by our past? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped you grasp the incredible, complex mechanics behind the rise and fall of history's great empires.